quite some time now, and before I start anything, we are grateful to Cal Poly Pomona College of Environmental Design providing us with the venue, and thank you very much for Archinec being one of the sponsors of the event, which will be recorded, and sometimes next week it will be broadcasted through the site. And of course, more than anything else, I want to say how grateful I am to introduce you Ray Cappy, who was my teacher, and I'm so proud to have him on my diploma. Questions for Ray, and I checked few of them prior to sitting on this table, and he already wrote off a couple of them, and so I have to do a little bit a spontaneous hopping here and there to get him interested talking about it. There are three basic areas that in last 3-4 years that people have been talking to Ray about. A, his prefab houses that he designed for living homes. B is SCI-Arc. And C, his own house. So I want to ask Ray, what is in between? Let's start with that, Ray.
In between was Cal Poly, for starters.
Okay.
As long as that, who's here tonight? No, right after I finished my house, actually, I was asked if I was interested in coming out to Cal Poly to start the architecture program, which was then going to be the third leg to begin the School of Environmental Design eventually, in the College of Environmental Design today. And so it was kind of an exciting period for me, because I always felt that environmental design programs, really never worked too well, because architecture was always too large in numbers, and the other two programs were always smaller and always seemed to be out of balance. And so I thought, in this case where landscape and planning already existed and architecture would be the third leg, it would be a more, possibly a better chance to put together a program that might work. So anyway, that was my first opportunity to be involved in education, and for me it was very exciting, as I said, and I had the opportunity to make the program in architecture totally from scratch, and other than for two professors who were there, Bernard Zimmerman and Dick Chilinsky, who were really in landscape at that time, but those were the two that would then join me in architecture initially. But everyone else I was able to hire and write the program with really no interference from the administration at all. Hugh LaBounty at that time was vice president and a tremendous supporter of architecture, and so it was a nice beginning. And in that, actually, without having to ask a question, one of the times that was very interesting in that process was when we came here to hire Richard Neutra. And you see a survival through design, Richard Neutra, Cal Poly Pomona. That was largely Bernard Zimmerman's idea, but one that I was also very supportive of. And so we came to the house to see Neutra, and I came with the vice president and the president. And they began to ask him some of the strangest questions. I mean, it was, for us, it was sort of exciting to have somebody of his stature come to Cal Poly to teach, and they seemed to be more interested in what grants he might be able to get and these kinds of things. And so there was a lot of this kind of questioning. And so that, in the end, it was okay with Neutra because he also had his agenda, which I think was to get most of his speeches on, recorded and have people on staff write them, and so he'd have that, and then he had a lot of slides he wanted to have duplicated. So he had his agenda, and they had their agenda, but it was a nice experience, and Neutra was exciting to have there, and that was quite good.
At one point, there's something happened, and you decided to quit Cal Poly and start SCI-Arc. What was the exact moment that I was talking a little bit to Shelley before we started this, and she said you might talk to us about that.
Well, I can talk to it briefly.
Briefly is fine.
Okay. Well, the three departments were doing fine. I mean, except that I asked at the beginning that architecture be no larger than 200 because that was the size of landscape and planning. Each time summer would take place and they would start to make their proposals, which came really from the administration above, the program would grow again. So from the time I came on in '68, there were 25 students, and in the 3.5 years that we were there, it had grown to 350. And once it grows to 350 and we're bigger than the others, then you have this problem of, I think, jealousy among the programs. The dean was being very divisive as well. He seemed to be trying to stir all that up, and I guess he had problems with me for some reason. We never had words. I had fought for Bernard Zimmerman's tenure. That might have gotten him a little bit upset. But we would go into meetings and come out of meetings, and I'd give what I had to do to my secretary, or assistant as they're called now. And she always did a great job on it, and every time, another day later, Bill Dale would come in, who was the dean, and say, that isn't what we said in the meeting. And I said, well, that's the way I heard what was going on in the meeting. And this went on about 2-3 times. And so one day I called Bill into my office, which is sort of a reversal, where the chair calls the dean in instead of the other way around. And I said, Bill, what are you doing? You're creating a very divisive situation here, and so forth and so on. It got a little heavier than that. I used a few stronger words. And and that was the first time we ever had this kind of an exchange. We had always been reasonably friendly before. A week later, he asked me to resign my position as chair. And I said, what for? It seems kind of strange over one issue that I don't agree with you on to start to change that. And I was a full professor tenured, so I didn't have to leave. And it grew into a whole cause célèbre. The students liked the program. They started doing graphic stuff all over the school. We had a Professor Adi Lati who was great at silk screening, and as you remember probably. And so there were images of me and this and all. It was really pretty wild. And so it grew into that, and then there was a big all-school meeting of that with Kramer, who was the president, who I didn't really know at all. My relationships were with LeBounty, who was the vice president. And so that didn't go well. During that meeting, I guess he asked me what my intentions were, and I said my intentions were to make Cal Poly one of the best schools in the country. And his answer to that was, we're not interested in Cal Poly being one of the best schools in the country. I said, well, I guess this certainly isn't the place I want to be then. And so anyway, the younger faculty who weren't tenured, and I and Shelley and
Glenn.
Well, Glenn wasn't tenured yet either. So we all got together and one day decided, why don't we just start our own school? We had met quite a few times with the students out on campus. They were building these rhombic dodecahedrons, and they were placed on the campus, and we wanted to explore some behavioral close packing ideas. And that sort of became the rallying point for all of this. And after those meetings, the students got more excited about the whole idea. And that's when then we left. So that's the story. It was rather quick and simple. and I found that all tenured faculty back away when they're asked to support anybody because they're afraid of their own positions. So when I started SCIARC, we set up a whole different kind of a program.
But you also brought with you a certain image, certain culture of both for the faculty and the students. And when I first walked into SCIARC, I remember very well that there were spaceship models hanging from the ceiling, the airplane parts, the wings, and all that. And the place didn't look like a school, so there was the love at first sight for me. And there are a lot of this new or going into sort of an unknown, risky business, perhaps, in comparison to the structured curriculum of typical architecture schools. As I remember, there was only SCIARC and AA in London that had some kind of an affinity in terms of what you could do with the education, architect's education. So there was this very definite forward-looking school. That was my first immediate impression, and I think the school still banks on that image. And there were few key people. There were you and Shelley, but I want to bring his name up here, and I will ask you a question about this person, Glenn Small, our friend. And Glenn was responsible for a lot of that sort of energy as well. Could you talk a little bit about that, what he brought in terms of the school? To
SCIARC or to Cal Poly?
To the world.
To both. Okay. Well, one thing, and this wasn't with Glenn particularly, but at Cal Poly we did a lot of inflatable work and so forth. That was with the group Chrysalis, that was connected to Archigram or been taught by Archigram. So we did a lot of things there that were sort of experimental and fun. Okay, the rhombic dodecahedron, the close packing thing that took place was really my idea, but Glenn and Adi and Bill Simonian carried it through at Cal Poly, and that was the first. The idea was to build out of plywood, minimum waste, no waste really. They built it that way, and a lot of that was Glenn. I mean, he was the instigator. When we got to SCIARC again, of course, Glenn and Nadi taught the first year program, and that program was meant to really get the students excited about things. So they built tents, they traveled through the city. You probably remember a lot of that.
I do.
There was paper structures. There were these just lots of things, and Glenn was. He's a very talented guy. I hired him initially because his drawings were fantastic. He had beautiful drawings, and he was, his ideas were a little beyond reality, but they were fun.
It's very interesting.
By a more biosphere was, up a mile in the sky over the whole city of LA. I mean, that was his thesis project at Cranbrook, but beyond that, I mean, he had a lot of other ideas, and his ideas were ones that I enjoyed and I felt strongly about.
It's interesting enough that the last month he was here, and he was invited by SCI-Arc and one of the well-known architecture critics, Jeffrey Kipnis. I don't know if you have any interaction with him.
I've never had interaction.
It is somewhere between being very precise and also somewhat know how to carry on the sort of fun type of criticism that goes serious and fun in the same time. Anyway, he comes up to Glenn and says, how does it feel to be 40 years too early? And in a way, that's the way that you were mentioning Rambix and all that. I don't know if you have seen the solar decathlon competition.
I saw some of it. I didn't see it. I've just seen a couple of examples.
Okay. Well, it seems like there are a lot of ideas that were planted at the time. There's kind of people are starting to touch base with, as you mentioned, the ideas of Rambix and modular, multiple architectural units coming together right now. So I'm going to leave the Recapi to the educator to kind of ease into Recapi, the architect. Not that it can be separated just like that, but just for the conversation's sake, there was an interesting moment I had with you. At one point, we ran into each other, I think it was 15 years ago, and you asked me out of blue, said what I was doing. And I said I was doing few houses and all that. And you kind of almost warningly said, be careful.
That doesn't sound like me.
Well, you don't remember, but I do, because it had an impact on me. And then I asked you, why should I be careful about this? And then you said, once you start to do houses, you kind of, there's a danger of getting stuck doing houses all the time. People are going to come here and ask you houses all the time. So if I were to rephrase the question to you now, same way, what's the danger, really? You can say that.
I still, I mean, that's what happened to me. That's what happened to many of earlier Los Angeles architects. I mean, this was an area where the house was what most architects started with. There were only a few large firms in the city, and there wasn't a lot of so much public work going on or bigger scale work. And so, architects like John Lautner, Pierre Koenig, myself, many of the architects of that era just ahead of me, did primarily houses, small commercial, and that was pretty much it, other than for Dim Jim, A.C. Martin, and they were the major two, and then the only one who really, of my generation that came along, was able to develop a larger practice was Dan Dworsky. But Dan never did houses. So that's usually what happens. So if you do houses well, usually what happens is that people come to you for houses. I've always enjoyed doing houses, but we've done a lot of other work too. I was always interested in urban design, urban issues, and planning issues, and so the firm that we made in our case was one that about half our work was in that area, and then we had some public work, and then we still had some houses. So that was the way I sort of moved out of houses. And if it wasn't for postmodernism, we probably would have been in larger work, but we were not willing to compromise like most firms had to do if they were really doing that work, because almost all the public work was being pushed that way. And so anyway, the timing for us was off, and so all I guess I was saying was that if you start in housing, quite often that's where you end up.
Yeah, it had an impact on me. I stopped doing architecture because of that.
Really? That's too bad. But John Lautner particularly was disturbed and upset by the fact that he didn't get larger work. People were afraid of what he would do, which is interesting today. I mean, because you have successful architects today who are doing the kind of thing that John was doing years ago, and getting the larger scale work and the big commissions. But at that time, it was very difficult, and the control was different for that.
One of your larger scale projects, the transportation center in Santa Monica, was one of the buildings that I really enjoy. Even today, that I will, whenever I'm in Santa Monica, I will go by and look at it. And can you talk a little, because it was a kind of a pioneering building at the time. It was in 1980s?
1980, yeah.
Yeah, and it was one of those buildings fully integrated solar strategies and environmental, the conserving strategies. And at the time, it was not necessarily, even though it's only 30 years ago, it was not a very popular thing. I remember some very famous architects today that they wanted to evict that kind of ideas from their projects because it didn't look good, and but you went ahead and did it.
Yeah, well, for us it was a really nice opportunity, because it was a good scale. One, we could use the analogy of the bus as part of the idea, and get into metal skins, which I hadn't had an opportunity to do before. Have a building that looked technologically a little more like, tech. But the solar stuff and the environmental was key in the whole process too. So the building really went from, it was sort of a 24-hour building, because some of the bus drivers were there at night, and some, they moved. And so the way the sun moved was sort of the way the building worked. And then we also we daylighted. I wanted to not have any air conditioning in the building, and that we would scoop air from the ocean, but the engineer wouldn't go along with that, and so they put on some air conditioning units. But in that location, I think it would have worked well, because I designed it with a plenum that would gather this air and then be brought back into the unit in a good way. So the building really worked, I think, all the way around. The west sun was allowed to gather in the afternoon, because the room next to it was the night room, and so we would gain that heat, and that would be then brought in. But that all started with me in 1975, when the energy code changed in the state of California, and all my projects from 75 to 85, roughly, always dealt with energy ideas and strategies. And I was curious if it really affected what a building looks like, and in a sense it doesn't have to. I mean, I oriented buildings differently, and material-wise you would use whatever, same as I would have before in many ways. The buildings didn't look like typical energy buildings that were being done at that time. There was a group I think more in the Southwest. Those buildings were usually in the ground in some way, or using trom walls, and that was about the end of it, and they all kind of looked in sort of a similar way. The buildings I was doing, I think, really had their same characteristics that they would have had, but would be oriented in a way that they would work better. So it was just another exploration for me. My life in architecture has really been worked on probably two ideas. You know, in the early '60s, I wanted to get into modular housing. I made proposals, and I had a scheme that I wanted to have done, and then I started doing my private houses with that attitude. I couldn't do. It doesn't make sense to do a one-off prefab. That's one of the problems. And so, but I was studying it more from a standpoint of how do you break a building down volumetrically, and how do you get more space out of it without it being box-like and being in a module. And so that was, it took, well, how many years? You say 40 years ahead of your time. It took till 2004, from about 64, that's 40 years, to get a chance to finally try it, And that was when, with Living Homes, I was able to do a similar bit. I mean, there were some changes, but similar to what I had proposed. And I was able to get a pretty good space out of a modular house, I think, and that was probably the strength of that particular project. But the years, I mean, if I can drop back in the planning area, in the urban design area, I mean, we used to propose so many things in the '60s, and they still aren't in place. It takes 30, 40, 50 years for things to happen. So things like that don't happen too quickly. It becomes a question, does that make sense to always be looking to the future and how you propose in the future? Or is it better really, to act in the present, which is more realistic, because the other never seems to happen unless you just enjoy doing it. And I guess I enjoyed that for many years. And we tried. We had transportation systems. We had lots of things. We tried to sell it to the state legislature. I mean, I used to be a lot more energetic than I am now. And we'd go out and really work hard, but we couldn't get anybody to come get behind. We'd go over to RAND, we'd go to the other think tanks around us in Santa Monica and try to get people there interested. Nobody was ever interested. So it's just very, very difficult to get things off the ground that way, unless you, I don't know what it would be like today, because today or in recent years, you have so many billionaire investors in the country, who are interested in investing in ideas, even if they know they're going to fail, which is rare. That wouldn't be the case, 40 years ago. Today, they figure if they get 1 out of 10, they might hit a big winner, and make themselves another $1 billion, and they don't care if they lose on the other 9.
What would be a winning trend today in architecture? Let's say
in architecture, I know my thinking was always in planning more than it was in urban issues than it was in architecture.
Well, okay, then
in architecture, I do the same thing now I did in the '60s most of the time, because that's the only thing that people come back to me for. And so I don't look at, I see what the students do today, and with their, from the computer modeling that they can do, and having computer programs like Maya, etc., that give them formal projects that are mind-blowing, in a way. I mean, it's just a different way of approaching architecture, totally. So what comes out of that is, who knows? I mean, if they're entrepreneurial enough to get them be able to do some of the stuff, or if they get into firms where that's possible, obviously, there's going to be more and more interesting kinds of buildings. It's not my kind of architecture. I mean, but it's the kind of thing that I think probably is going to happen, and it's not, it's not so different from going back to Glenn Small again, what Glenn used to do with his little models and hyperbolic stuff and all the, the kinds of forms and shapes that he was able to do in without the computer. And so, but now with the computer, when I go to SciArc once in a while to look at what's being done, it's amazing to me what the students do. I don't know what they can do in real architecture, but
but the thing is,
in fantasy land in the movies, it looks good.
It's not only in SciArc anymore. It's in every school.
Every school. No, I know that, but I don't put every school.
But here's the question, right? Since it's like in every school, it's like that. You see a whole, huge production of this kind of work. That made possible with the technology, but there are very few examples of that are. It hasn't really unified with the people yet. That it always speaks to either a power structure or a wealth structure and all that. And do you see any kind of a way all these sort of advancements can come back and reconcile people with architecture?
Well, I don't know that I agree with you on that. I mean, I don't know how you categorize, let's go to Frank's buildings, that's what always happens. But if you go to Bilbao, that spoke to a hell of a lot of people. People I would never have guessed would even, like that architecture at all. So, and obviously Disney Hall does. So, I mean, these are buildings that I think people relate to. Certain people do, and I think younger people particularly do. Younger generations. Not so much, again, in housing or the house, but in, museums and theaters and buildings that are that scale or larger exhibition spaces and so forth. I think people relate to that and into those kind of forms. Is that what you're saying? Or am I missing?
A little bit, both. And traditionally, I mean, even in school, we were taught, and bombarded with this idea that architecture needs money or follows money. And today, there's a lot of this number game is being talked about, 99%, 1%. Is it true that architecture follows money? And second is, are the 99% of the architects are working for 1% of the population?
Well, that's probably true. I mean, it isn't that architecture follows money. They're hired by those people. I mean, we don't work in a vacuum. So, if we'd like to do, I mean, there are a lot of architects, and we were like that, and we would love to do low-cost housing. We'd love to do housing for, that level. In my firm, we had one opportunity, and and at that time there were quite a few firms being able to do it, but it wasn't successful. I mean, it was for minority groups who didn't really want this kind of housing. It was mass housing that they didn't relate to. They wanted their individual house, just like this guy here and that guy there down the street, and it didn't work. It worked for the Asians. Any low-income housing for Asians seemed to work, but for other minority groups, it didn't. And it was quite disappointing in the end. And then there were lots of attempts at that. I think all of us would like that. That's why I was interested in prefabrication, whether that could help the costs in any way. But what ends up in reality is who hires you, If you're doing public work, you're speaking to the people in a different way. But if you're doing private work, you're hired by people who are moneyed, and you can't get away from that. And that's who calls the shots. Architects don't call the shots. you know, they do the best they can within the framework in which they're able to work. Houses today, I mean, I remember sitting in front of a group years ago and saying, well, you know, houses are starting to cost $100 a square foot. Let's forget about it. There won't be any more private housing. Who can afford $100 a square foot? You know, but you know, who are my clients today? What clients I have are people who have money. That's all. I mean, they don't have to worry about loans. They buy, you know, they can pay for it without that, and that's who hires people to do. Those are the housing you get to do. But you know, I would love to do the other end. I would love to do community scale work. I'd prefer to work for the public, but how do you get that work? You know, and if you want to get public work today, you know, I'm down at UC San Diego on the design review board down there, and I watch what goes on at a university. I mean, God, I mean, for every project that comes in, there's 55 architects going after that one job, and major firms with major portfolios, and you know,
bidding,
hoping to get in, and then it's knocked down to maybe 3-4 that come in out of that, where you might have 25 of those are all qualified, 30 might be qualified, and then you're down to 4 or 5. And all the buildings down there, of course, now are mostly laboratory buildings, so if you haven't done 20 laboratory buildings, it's pretty hard to get a job. I mean, but I mean, that goes on for, I mean, I don't know how many people here are architects, but and maybe in that game, but it's tough. I mean, it's really tough marketing today. I didn't have to market my whole life, really. But if I had to market today, I'd find it really, really, really hard, because you know, you walk into a room and there's people, 10 people looking at you, and you don't know one from the other, and you're supposed to make this proposal, and you're trying to guess, you know, maybe what they might be thinking in their heads, unless you have any previous experience with them, and that's not easy to do. You know, and so one group comes in, you know, they come in all suited up and da-da-da, and the group that's watching them says, I don't like those guys are too, you know, how do you define people who come in suits? Okay. And then another group, you know, is very casual. Oh, they're great. You know, so it's how they're looking, it's what they're addressing, it's how they say what they do, it's what the team is. You know, there's got to be one of these and one of those and one of this. I mean, it's a tough game. It's a tough game out there if you're trying to get that kind of work. And you know, most architects know that they're going to get, if they get 1 out of I don't know what. If they get 1 out of 10, I think they think
it's very successful.
They're
1 out of 10 is good.
They're doing really great. You know, so you know, firms spend a great deal of their time making proposals, period. And that isn't, I don't think that's terribly fun to do. But that's what goes on.
That's what it is.
Yeah, but I don't think you can fault the system. I mean, I was one who always, all my life, was an empiricist, so I never trusted this or that, and so I had to go through the process to decide whether it was right or wrong. That's what I tried to do at SCI-Arc. I thought, well, there must be another way to educate besides the way we do it. What will happen if we open up the whole thing wide open? Where will it go? It ends up going pretty close to what it did before. And I think that's true in society in general. When you try to make the change, it seems to come around back kind of to the same damn place. And so that gets a little frustrating, that you can't move things the way you would like to move them through as long as you have a democratic process. I mean, you know, if you have a completely autocratic process, you have a better chance. But even there, you know, look at our world today.
I think you just described the most frustrating part of architectural practice. You know, most architects that I know of, that they all feel the similar sort of helplessness, almost not getting into it. But I think it's changing. However,
that's because you're younger than I am.
but there are people who are younger.
And these guys, I'm sure, think it's
there are people younger than me,
and I hope it does.
Who are camping right now in across from City Hall. I'm very hopeful about those people.
Right.
I mean, besides MTV wants to make money on them and that. But Ray, we are coming to the close, and I'm going to open this conversation to the audience, and they're going to ask questions. But before, I don't want us to go out like this on a this kind of how to make money thing. But when I first walked into your house, immediately, I went to my typewriter, computer, and I wrote this, and you're one of the people that is kind of uncanny about. I know you work from the rational end, you put the program together, you work all the tangents of clients and all that, but there's a very poetic side to your work, and it comes out so naturally. Probably you don't even plan on it, because that's how you are. And I wrote, Kappy houses are interesting in that they visually take you to places without you physically moving an inch. His spaces don't stop. You can look, but you won't see a line that doesn't depart, travel, connect, or fly away into the canyons. He's daringly modern, moving you through the bottlenecks of organized combustion before dropping you in his poetry of space, architectural construction, scale, light, and experiment. Am I close on this, or am I just...
Perfect.
Okay.
I certainly couldn't say it that well. No, I don't know. I think beyond the rational, there's the intuitive, and what happens is that's the person. Okay, and as you say, it happens because of the way a person is, and that just, that's just the way it works for me. I start in a very simple way. I don't consciously try to push everything to somewhere, and but it sort of happens. I'm a person, I think I've said it lots of times, I like structure, but I like to be able to break structure. And I think I'm sort of in the middle that way. I don't try to do everything, make it new, make it something else. I have nothing wrong. I think, I believe in continuity. And I always believed in the continuity of the modern movement, and because it had lots of variations to work within. And but at the same time, I think you can set up a set of rules, but they get broken in certain ways at certain times, and that's what makes the job interesting. And that some of that is just happening. Some of it is intuitive, as I said, and some of it is, I don't know, you just don't know. I've been surprised lots of times in my work. I think most architects do. Sometimes you can't it's pretty hard to know everything that's going to happen. You certainly can't figure out every reflection that's going to happen when you put in some glass, and how that changes your perception and so forth. Neutra always like to use mirrors, like outside there and so forth, to change perception. I didn't like that, because I always thought it was a little bit pushing in the wrong way. But I did always like glass, because glass reflects in a similar way and sometimes can almost mirror. But you're not putting the glass in necessarily to do that. You're usually putting the glass in to be able to look outside, to nice trees, what's happening externally. And what happens on the glass sometimes is quite a surprise. As the light changes from one side to the other, you get reflections back and forth. And that's the wonder of it all. And the way as the seasons change and the sun comes in and the moon comes up and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's what's fun to me. And a lot of that is you can't, you could figure it out, but I don't think there's too many architects. They don't even want to figure out how you build the building, let alone how all the sun is going to come in at every point and do what it's going to do. I mean, we just don't, there aren't that many who are really research oriented to that degree that they could spend that much time. I don't think that's where architects get their total enjoyment. But what you get from it is, I think, exciting, and a lot of times you don't have to figure it all out, and things happen.
I want to open to the audience now, if you are willing to answer a few questions before we...
I'm always willing to answer questions.
Let's...
I enjoy that more than giving lectures.
You told me you're not giving lectures anymore. You're only interested in friendly conversations like this.
If I give a lecture, it's always the same lecture, and it bores me terribly.
Trish?
You were talking about before, because I was interested about technology and how technology has changed how the student work and how people are, and what is built and what is versus what is imagined. And I was wondering how you feel about sort of I don't want to call it the death, but for lack of a better word, the death of hand drawing in architecture.
Well, when I am with educators, and I am a consultant to a program in Ireland, a new program, and that program, when I first met the young architect, an excellent architect who was heading it up, he really wanted to, we talked about when do you introduce the computer and when don't you, and how much hand drawing should people do and how much modeling should they do before, as they get started, rather than jumping straight into the computer. So they experimented there over the last 7 years with that. And he waited a little too long to introduce computer, because the way and it might have just been the way the students were taught drawing. They were taught drawing in sort of a strange way, more the way you would draft, not so much the way you would draw or present, because those are two different levels of the process. The students tended to be more draft-like over there than they were presentation-oriented. And so the projects, first of all, you can hardly ever see them. I mean, I could sit here and it's up there, you can hardly see the presentations. They were so light. And they had the same person teaching this all the time, which I thought was too bad. And a couple of years ago, when I was back, they finally introduced more computer work, and brought in a person who was much more graphically skilled and so forth. And the work just jumped miles from where it was before, just because now, it was just much. But it wasn't that it was still work that would be more CAD oriented. I mean, if you were bringing up imagery from CAD and that kind of modeling, or Rivet or whatever people use today, that's one point. But when you get into things like Maya, and there's something else. I mean, they just make for them, I guess. I don't know. I see this stuff all the time that the guys do. So all I'm saying is, I think most educators in architecture still would like people to learn to draw hand by hand, do some modeling, get into the process through another way, because it's a completely different process. The way I learned, and I go back quite a ways, but we learned kind of the old way, which was you really draw your plan, your thinking section, your drawing perspectives, you're doing all of this. So when you design a building, you're walking yourself through the building quite closely with your hand drawing. Now, if you come the other way and all of a sudden here's your form, before you've even thought about anything else, and you say, wow, that's a great form. Now how can I use it? You know, I mean, I think that's the reversal. I may be wrong, but that's my impression of the way it works. So if you're form-oriented first, it's a different process. And a lot of architects before computer use were also more formally oriented. They would design the buildings from the outside in rather than the inside out. So it's just a different way. And I'm not saying one necessarily is better than the other, but that was just the way that most architects used to work. And I think anybody over, probably 55 years old or so still probably does that. They have people in their office who are doing computer drawings, but they're still making their proposals by hand drawing and thinking that same way, but then allowing the other to come into play as well, which I think probably makes things more interesting in many ways. I don't do that. I mean, I never even made models. I always did everything by drawing. We made models only to show to the client, to make them understand the project better. But I never designed by model. Okay, now Glenn Small, who we were talking about before, actually designs by model. He's just 10 years younger than I am, but he doesn't necessarily, he can draw very well, but he doesn't, at the same time, he doesn't think the same way. He thinks much more formally than, say, I would. And personally, Gary would be more, even though he was trained the other way, thinks probably more formally, and some architects do. So the computer, I think, works for that better, probably, than the other process, because particularly, I mean, if you're doing formal things. So I think there's so many different ways to do architecture that there isn't one straight way for anybody, and I think each one has to really decide for themselves what works, and if you start in the first year, as you do, I think at SARC now, with programs like, I guess, Maya and that kind of thing. I mean, they're already making forms right off the bat. The problem with that is when you get out in the world, as many of you know, Tony, I'm sure, and others who worked in housing, and I mean, you don't work that way, and I mean that isn't reality in most smaller projects that we do. We don't start that way. We're starting with program, we're starting with site, we're starting with all the issues that we have to face. We're not just always just making some form and saying, here, throw it on the site somewhere. And the trouble, that's the hard part. And I think in school you have to be able to explore, but I think students should have a sense of some sense of reality of what they're going to have to face when they get out, because they'll be very disappointed otherwise. They're the first thing they know, they're doing all of this stuff that they don't find very interesting. So architecture is not interesting to them. It was always interesting to me, because I wasn't trying to, do something that was so far out. I mean, I wasn't completely conservative, but I mean, I wasn't that far away.
I don't think anybody can call you conservative, Ray. There's one thing.
Hey, Ray, you keep echoing pragmatism, but from what I know about you, you've done some very interesting technological things that were pushing the envelope.